So I'm on AP US Modern History Unit 5, which includes the revolutions. This is the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, including political revolutions like the American Revolution, French Revolution, women's rights, Latin American Revolution, and then the Industrial Revolution. So through all these revolutions, they're just like big changes in society that happened throughout the times, and like especially around like 1700 to 1800s. There was like less war, so more time for innovation, changes in like thought process, but overall, there's just a lot of major changes. But while we're learning about the Industrial Revolution, I have my freaking school notes because I'm so smart. But during the Industrial Revolution, we also learned about different forms of the economy because, Industrial Revolution is a lot about, making products and stuff, and that has to do a lot with economy. So, people who are involved in the Industrial Revolution will obviously think more about the flow of money and like stuff like that. So the two main forms we learned is capitalism and socialism/communism. Basically these two polar opposites in a sense that are both theories of economy, but they both they're kind of like conflicting ideas. But in the end, I'm not trying to argue which one's better. I'm just gonna explain my thought process on what I've learned in this American school education system, and then also point out that I think communism, for one, definitely has a worse reputation than it deserves. I've seen this as an example through like multiple people who have I've heard visibly express disgust for communism, and like as a form of, I think communism doubles as a form of government as well as economy, but most people just don't express much appreciation for communism, which understandable. It doesn't work much in like actual reality and all that good stuff. But I think in theory, communism definitely has its perks, and people don't actually understand the whole idea. But I'll get into that later. Basically, we learned in school that capitalism, for one, founder Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, because you have to have a founder in a textbook for some reason. But in The Wealth of Nations, this pro-capitalist book, he goes through these major beliefs that we wrote down. One is no government interference, which makes sense. Everyone does their own thing, and the government doesn't mess with anything. That makes sense. Following the natural flow of supply and demand, that also makes sense. The people they demand stuff, the companies supply it. That makes sense. And then self-interest, I'm assuming this is a huge, major part of capitalism because it's mainly built on your self-interest to like get rich and like your own self-gain. So you're gonna like want to make a company and like get rich on your own stuff. So in that aspect, it makes sense. It's built on self-interest. You're fighting for yourself. You're trying to get rich for yourself. That's the whole idea of capitalism. But the main downside, I think this is the biggest like negative of capitalism. That's kind of the bad thing, is unequal wealth, which it makes sense because in capitalism, if everyone's doing their own thing and people are trying to fight to get rich, inevitably you're going to have the super rich people who made it and work really hard, and you're also going to get the people who don't work hard or just fail to work hard, or like their business fail or something, and they're just going to be poor or something. So inevitably you will have unequal wealth in capitalism, and then in that process there's rich and there's poor, and in the end not everybody gets happy. Not the whole population will be in the best of conditions. So that's the downside. But to double check with the internet to make sure I don't have anything wrong, capitalism is an economic system based on private ownership for the means of production for their operation of profit. Central characteristics include capital accumulation, no clue what that is, capital or competitive markets. That makes sense. Obviously, the companies will be competitive if products are similar, so which actually helps the population, because if two companies are competitive, then they're going to lower prices, which is better for the people. They're also going to try to innovate more, which is also better for the people, because the better product they make, the more convenient it is for the country and the people. So innovation and lower prices is definitely a benefit of competitive markets, which therefore is a benefit of capitalism. Price systems, I don't know what that is. Private property, that seems like common sense. You have private ownership of certain things. Property rights recognition, I'm assuming that's just recognition of property rights. Obviously, it's just private property. Voluntary exchange, I'm assuming that's just natural flow of the economy that isn't inhibited by government. And wage labor, obviously, you get a job and you get paid. That's the idea. You have to work to get money and all that good stuff. Basically, I think it lines up with the gist of our teachings. The main idea of capitalism is it's no government, and it's all you, and it's all about people working for themselves in their self-interest to become wealthy and all that good stuff. And I heard our teacher also said another big thing about capitalism is what is it called, equal opportunity, because everyone's presented with the same opportunity to get rich, and whether you take that opportunity to like do something with it, that's up to you. But in the end, people will take that opportunity and get rich, and then some people will not, and then they'll just be poor or something. So that's the idea of capitalism. That's what America runs on, I'm pretty sure. Our teacher also told us that capitalism and communism are not necessarily like complete right or wrongs. It's an aspect of how much on the spectrum of capitalism and communism, where on that spectrum do you want to be. It's not a matter of are you a socialist / communist. It's a matter of how much socialism / communism, how much capitalism do you want in their nation to make it function properly. But basically, that's the idea of capitalism. It works. Our teacher basically explained that it's a perfect catalyst for self-interest and like selfishness, because it takes people's like selfishness and their desires for self-gain, and then it takes it as a catalyst and springs it into a form of government or a form of economy that actually like really works really well. But that's capitalism. That's what we learned. And the other hand is socialism / communism. Apparently socialism is like the halfway point between capitalism and communism. At least that's what we were taught. And communism is the hardcore version. And what we learned in the notes, founder of communism, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, I don't really know who that is. They wrote the Communist Manifesto. I will not be reading that. I didn't actually write down major beliefs for some reason. I was zoned out, I guess. But communism, I get the idea, is basically, in contrast to capitalism, the idea of equal wealth. Because capitalism is unequal wealth. There's going to be rich, there's going to be poor. In communism, everyone's the same wealth. The wealth of the nation is distributed equally among the people. So you're not going to have extreme rich people. You're also not going to have extreme poor people. Everyone's going to have the same wealth and be given the same thing. So in that aspect, everyone works. It's a really interesting idea in theory. Like it's like a perfectly flowing machine. Everyone gets equal stuff. Everyone's given everything they need: food, shelter, freaking cars, whatever they need. Everyone's given that, but there's no extreme wealth, and there's also no extreme poor. And then in the end, the downside of that, I guess, is that nobody has a particular need to innovate because they're not making a business. It's not in their self-interest to innovate because they don't gain anything necessarily. So in that aspect, there's like no need for innovation, at least in terms of self-gain. And then there's no need for, literally anything else. And this big example that I heard that's like anti-communist, I heard it first in 5th grade from our teacher. He said, in capitalism, if you work hard, you get a promotion and you get paid more. And then if you don't do work, you get fired. In communism, if a person who works less and a person who works a lot more work together, they're given the same thing or something. And I see how that example makes sense, because obviously in communism, if everyone's given the same thing regardless of like work ethic, I guess, then in that idea, I was really confused when I heard that example, because I'm like, wait, if everyone's given the same thing regardless of work ethic, what if nobody works? Does that mean everyone's given the same thing? I don't actually know the answer to that question. I'm assuming there's some form of punishment that if you don't do work, obviously you're not contributing, so you're going to get punished or something, and you won't be provided by the government or something. So I would assume that's the option, or else no one would do work in a communist world, but that's just what I'm assuming. Basically, the idea is that everyone's equal. There's no fighting for wealth. It's just you're split the wealth of the nation. So it's an interesting idea of like brotherhood, or I guess like nationalism. Everyone's equal and all that good stuff. And it's what China claims to be, but apparently they're not really communist. They're more of a form of socialism, which is partially government distribution of wealth, and then partially, people make their own businesses and all that good stuff. And I heard our teacher gave us this really interesting quote. They said, a famous quote from China, translated to English, is like, I don't care if it's the black cat or a white cat as long as it catches fish, which apparently just resembles the idea that they don't care what form of government or what form of economy they use as long as it makes them money, and which it makes sense, and that kind of like blew my mind. I'm like, that's a pretty slick quote. I'm gonna be inspired by that one. But essentially, no form of communism has worked in the modern world apparently, because apparently our teacher explained that in all attempts at modern day communism, they eventually inevitably become a dictatorship, because communism, I wasn't paying attention to how that happened, how that process happens, but I'm assuming it's the fact that when you're doing equal distribution of wealth, somebody has to be in control of that, and somebody has to like take the lead, I guess. So in the end, there's going to be like a dictator who like kind of controls the economy in the end. At least that's what I'm assuming, but I could be very wrong about that. In the end, no form of communism apparently has worked in the modern day because of like dictatorship and all that good, or freaking, I don't know, just like human error. But I get the idea that communism doesn't actually work in like reality, because in the end you're not gonna have everyone who's like how to say, like, no one's gonna be particularly satisfied being equal with each other. Everyone's always gonna be like, oh, I want to be better than the other guy. So that's why capitalism like channels that, you know, you want to get better than the people around you, so you work for your own self-wealth and self-interest. In communism, you can't really build upon those ambitions of like superiority. You kind of just have to stay level in terms of like wealth with everyone else. So I get the idea that not everyone can be satisfied with the idea, and also that example where they said like, oh, if one person works less, one person works more, then, you know, the person who works less gets the same treatment as the person who works more. In that aspect, I was thinking like, in a perfect world, if everyone was super patriotic, then hypothetically everyone would be working to their very best extent. And like hypothetically, in theory, like communism is great. Communism is actually perfect, because if you think everyone is perfect, everyone loves the country, and everyone works super hard, that's great. Everyone works super hard, they love it, they get stuff done, and in return, the government redistributes wealth equally among everyone. Everyone's happy. The freaking whole nation functions like a well-oiled machine. There's no extreme wealth. There's no extreme poor. It's just everyone's working together. And it's like that thing in Brotherhood, or that thing in Russia where they're like brotherhood and all that good stuff, because Russia is also like an attempted form of communism. It's a great idea in theory, with like everyone, the whole country working together as like one entity and like working so well together and like, you know, just getting better. But like in theory, in actuality, it doesn't actually work that well, because in the end, you know, people for one, appreciate capitalism for, you know, self-interest and like building upon that. And I'm trying to think of what other big downsides of communism that make it unworkable. But in the end, I guess it does work, but it just doesn't work to its fullest like extent in theory, just because of, you know, people not working as well. Like, especially since in an actual communist world, or an actual world, not everyone's going to be super patriotic, I guess. So, you know, there's going to be people who work less, and then I don't know how you deal with that in communism, because I didn't bother looking into it. But I guess communism does have its downsides, and capitalism does have its also downsides, and they both have their perks as well. But people look down on communism, at least I think in form of government. You know, that 5th grade teacher who explained that like, oh, one person works less, one person works harder, they get the same treatment, that's unfair, that's not right. And then, you know, I've heard that example way too many times. I asked other people, they're like, oh, I asked, especially after this lesson, I asked people like, what are their thoughts on communism? And they're like, I hate communism, it's evil. I'm like, it's not that deep, because in theory, I'm always going to mention, in theory, communism is the great idea. And I've heard people say, as the world progresses, we will have to adapt to a more communist world. And I'm also thinking in terms of capitalism, when there's extreme wealth, and, you know, people always say like wealth always returns back to the top 1%. Eventually, you're going to have really poor people and really wealthy people, and then, you know, this middle group. And the rich are going to get richer, and the poor are going to get poorer, and that's just not going to work long term. At least it's not the simulation in my brain. I feel like that wouldn't work long term. So I see the idea. In the future, we will have to shift to a more communist form of, you know, economy or society, I guess. But in the end, that's all there is to it. I asked my friend, like Toby, who's like a wholesome guy, but I guess he doesn't get it completely. He gave the exact same example as like the 5th grade teacher. He's like, oh, if one person works harder, one person works less, same treatment, communism doesn't work. I'm like, okay, what if everyone just works the best? But in the end, like, that's the only issue with communism. It's not a matter of the idea not working, it's a matter of the people not particularly getting it. Like, when people abandon everything for their own self-interest, that's when communism doesn't work, because it's all about working together. So that's all there is to it. That's my understanding of capitalism and communism. I think I understand it better after the teacher explained it. Our teacher is also really chill, and she likes to. A lot of people also like to ask her questions after class. She's just the type of person. I should definitely be asking her questions myself. But she's a chill teacher, and capitalism and communism are both cool, I guess. But they're both just forms of economy, and communism has its downsides, but in theory, it's definitely top tier. And all this debate over communism is trash, or at least what I hear in a high school environment of people saying communism is trash. I don't think they completely get the idea that communism is just an idea, and every idea works in theory, which is why it exists. But there's always downsides in reality that make it not work as well as it's meant to work. So in the end, that's really all there is. But that's capitalism and communism. Yeah.